Imagine a game where every time I swing my weapon, I drain all of my life back instantly, or where I can heal myself to full life indefinitely using a healing spell. What balance issues could this game possibly have? Let's talk about one of the most pervasive diseases ever to plague video game design. I call it the War of Rates. The War of Rates is the overblown competition between different forces over some resource value. The resource is usually health, but it could be mana, energy, ammo, etc., and the forces are the things that are trying to change it. Here's the most common example ever. I'm able to heal myself really quickly, and I can do it forever. For something to threaten me at all, it would need to damage me really quickly too. A rate war begins when the developers try to balance around this scenario. The competing forces, healing and damage, will both become nonsensically strong, like having two gladiators try to fight in a coliseum a tenth their size. The forces are just too large for the bounds. Changes occur in chunks. There could be moments when I'm not hitting anything and am not draining any life. I might get hit extra hard by something. I might run out of potions or healing spells. Typically, as a rate increases, so do fluctuations, and it's possible for those fluctuations to be spikes comparable in size to my maximum life. Take a value that could be fluctuating like this, and constrain it between a minimum and maximum like this. That's what a rate war can look like to a player. The only meaningful changes are gigantic spikes. So why is this such a bad thing, you might ask? Well, the whole purpose of having visible resources is so that players can react to how they change. If changes happen too fast, like when you take a huge damage spike, or if no changes ever happen, like when you're draining life faster than anything can damage you, that purpose is lost. A rate war makes it almost impossible for anything to happen other than one of those two extremes, neither of which makes that resource of any informational use to the player. Oh, and it also makes the game impossible to balance. At the point where healing and damage rates meet, you're basically immortal. Any more healing and you're still immortal. But decreasing healing a little bit or increasing damage a little bit will change longevity by a large fraction. It's this sensitivity to change that is the game developer's nightmare. Here is a scenario where we're fighting an enemy that can heal and we have no choice but to damage through the healing. We can't interrupt it or prevent it. What is an appropriate amount of healing for this enemy to do? Ideally, we want this enemy to be of similar difficulty to other enemies in the same area, so we might start by making it heal some fraction of the damage that players are able to do. But unless every group of players is exactly the same, we can't really tell what that means. If Group A does just a little bit more damage than Group B, Group A might end up having no problem against this enemy, while Group B can't defeat it at all. If we decrease the healing that the enemy does, now it might become trivially easy to both groups. If, for example, we want the healing to make the enemy 50% harder to defeat, then aren't we better off just giving it 50% more life? In this example, healing just created an immortality condition that made it impossible for us to predict how much tougher this enemy really is. The same goes for the reverse, where players are able to heal themselves. If each player is able to heal themselves at a different rate, the game developers literally cannot choose an ideal damage for some enemy to do to them. Rate wars are like the HIV/AIDS of game design. They take already existing balance challenges and make them more extreme. If we want to avoid rate wars, we can't let anything come anywhere near being immortal. Some of the most fun I've ever had in games involved being economical with something because I couldn't have infinite of it. Resource attrition is a major source of challenge and fun, but not in games that allow uncontrolled rate wars. Once I can have all the energy I'd ever want, well then energy isn't going to influence my choices. It becomes useless from a design standpoint. Why do I need these giant important looking globes on the screen if I'm never paying any attention to them? On one end, we have rate wars, and on the other, we have attrition. In other words, rate priority and capacity priority. We don't want too much of either, but games so very often allow the rate part to get out of control because it's the easiest to lose control over. Passive regeneration, life leech, spammable healing, spammable crowd control, flat damage reduction. These are all things that more often than not lead to rate wars and the death of balance. So why does this happen? Players, after all, are just trying to do what makes sense. If having infinity of something is an attainable goal, or even a nearly obtainable one, players are going to pursue it because it's so powerful. And if the game keeps allowing it, players are going to keep on pursuing it until spikes are the only showstopper. Here's a common story. We're developing a new game on our beta servers. We want to know if there are any problems, so we look at what some of the most successful players are doing. We notice that they're using a lot of life-regenerating items. In order to make the game challenging for these players, we greatly crank up the damage that some high-level enemies do. So, instead of actually addressing the long-term problem of regeneration being too powerful and other forms of damage mitigation being too weak, we've started a rate war. If we continue this pattern, we're going to ruin the game. Players will have to design their characters around the rate that they take damage rather than their capacity to survive it, and on goes the cycle. It's a red flag if players are trying to figure out how to stay alive longer, and the answer is always, more healing, more healing, more healing. It's a red flag if players are only threatened by spikes and one-shots. It's a red flag if anything seems to have an unlimited amount of mana or life. This whole presentation is a plea for game developers to be wary of rates. If some rate is too high somewhere in your game, don't fall into the trap of thinking that increasing an opposing rate is the only solution. Look at the whole picture, then ask the question, are players able to react meaningfully after they see a resource change? If they aren't, then they're sort of just watching the game play itself. We want resources to inform players' actions. To do this, resources need to spend a good amount of time at some intermediate value, not max all the time and not minimum all the time. Focus on making the ebbs and flows depend more on player input than on things the player doesn't pay any attention to, like drain or regeneration. Use resources as a way of making player choices more important. For example, make mana recovery depend more on what actions a player takes than on something continuous. Consider mana recovering abilities designed to be woven in between mana-consuming ones. Consider healing abilities that consume a different resource from other abilities, like an individual cooldown or a charge. You can still have opposing forces, you probably can't avoid having them. Just put real limitations on them. Use them as gameplay fuel. Sometimes solving a rate war in your game is as simple as literally reducing rates and increasing capacities, such as reducing damage and healing across the board and increasing life totals across the board. This is easier said than done most of the time though, since games can have design parasites dug in deep over years of development. But the aim is the same. Moderate the time that players have to react to things. A lack of time is a lack of control. I'm not saying that resources should be the only things that drive player behavior, but if they're right in front of the user interface, they ought to mean something.